Welcome to Dialogues in Design Early Career Conversations. Today we are going to be talking to Jake Rudin. Jake is the co founder and managing partner at Out of Architecture, a career consulting firm that helps creatively driven architects and designers find roles that challenge and fulfill them. He's passionate about helping others discover and pursue their unique talents and aspirations, and serves as a mentor, talent partner, and advisor at several startups, organizations, and individuals in the design and innovation space. Hi, Jake. Thank you so much for coming. It's a pleasure to have you on Dialogues in Design today.
Hi, Nikita. It's lovely to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
So, jumping straight to the questions to start with, if you could go back to your early days with the knowledge that you have today, what would you have done differently?
Yeah. My early days, they stretch as early as, time spent. I grew up in the South in Nashville. I loved building and making and music. My father is an audio recording engineer, and so I had all of these choices and paths in front of me of, what career to pursue. And I chose architecture initially, and I would make that exact decision again. And I think that may belie the name of my my business, of which I'm the co-founder, which is Out of Architecture. But I can tell you a little bit of that story, and it's almost the opposite answer to your question. I mean, what I would do again is a very different response than what I would change. And I think the expectation from a lot of people is that as someone who represents alternate career pathways in architecture, even the name of the brand Out of Architecture sort of connotes that's the wrong choice. But I loved my architectural educations. I have two very expensive degrees from haughty universities in the United States, and I have a bachelor's of architecture degree. I chose that because I had a class in high school that was civil engineering and architecture. And it was very, very early days of Revit. But I had, this project to design a lake house for one of my high school classes. And I got to do that inside of Revit. I got to learn Autodesk Inventor at the time and design a guitar inside of it, which I really loved. And I got a lot of this exposure to some of these skills and processes that I think, come up in architecture school as kind of foundational skills. And even at that early stage, I got to see not only their usage related to buildings, but also in all of these other contexts in civil engineering infrastructure, in product design. And I felt like that was something that was just an incredibly valuable suite of talents that I wanted to have. So I went to architecture school. I, put my best foot forward. I fell in love with the profession, with design, with this idea of becoming not only a star architect, but just the purest creative problem solver. I could not believe when my professors explained that a box is so much more than this just cubic thing, right? That it could be hollow. It could be, you know, it could be solid. It could have varying thicknesses. It's a composition of edges and nodes and corners and lines and connectivity. And you can imply a cube without having a cube there. And that blew my mind. It felt like this magic trick that we do, with design over and over and over again. But I butted up against a lot of uh, the sort of classic challenges in professional practice early in my career, or even as early as doing an internship in high school and watching the result of the 2008 financial crisis kind of play out in firms. One of my tasks, aside from maintaining the material library at the firm that I was working at, was cleaning out people's desks as they got furloughed or laid off. So I didn't have any pretensions that architecture was this like super safe, brilliant, pure profession. And when I got through school, I realized that what I loved about architecture, which I still to this day consider myself to be an architect in many ways, even though I'm not licensed. What I loved about architecture, I wasn't finding in professional practice, in working in a traditional firm, working in an architecture office. And I made a bunch of decisions to test the boundaries of that theory that ultimately led me to a somewhat lengthy career to date in a bunch of other spaces, building my own business, working at a young education technology startup. I spent almost 9 years at Adidas building a computational design team and working across R&D and product innovation. So to circle back to your question, I wouldn't change my choices, but I think I would highlight for those going through this process that there's nothing wrong with questioning the decisions in the moment. And that was something I'm very grateful for. Um, that I am irreverent in a lot of ways. I am someone who who is willing to look at, the typical path and say, well, I'm better than that, or I'm different than that, or I know this doesn't feel right, and for some reason I need to figure out why that is. So that's my response.
Wow, that's been such an amazing journey. I'm so glad you spoke about exploring in architecture. We're going to come to that. But you spoke about not having that safety in architecture, being a little confused. A lot of young graduates, including me, it feels a little confusing out there right after graduation. How did you deal with that?
Yeah, my my solution was to not graduate. So I did a I did a 5 year professional architecture degree, and in the last year, I had done internships at like star architecture firms in Italy, at really big firms here in the United States that would be considered sort of model architecture firms of 1,000 people doing international projects, and not having found, what felt right, I decided, academia feels really good. I'm going to go for a master's degree. And you may have experienced a small amount of this. But I went so far as to really think, I have a true passion for teaching. I love education. And so this wasn't, in a sense, a way to explore another career path and to look at potentially staying in academia as a professor, as an educator. Um, so I went for my master in design technologies to get closer to that level of a terminal degree. And in architecture, at the time, but even to this day, really a PhD is not the terminal degree. It is much more a master's and licensure that leads you into that kind of tenure track pathway. So my, instinct was, well, I'm gonna see what level of depth I can gain in one area of architecture, and that was this sort of technological exploration. Um, but my master in design technologies was far less of a single unified degree and much more of an exploratory sampling of design technologies. So I worked with robots to cut hot foam. I did 3D printing. I did, game design and visualization in Unity. I did computational design and 3D modeling and parametrics and this whole world of things, even, wearable devices and technologies. I did an entire project on eye tracking and, visuals in the built environment. And that exploration only fed this notion that architecture is such a small part of the world of physical spaces and things. That realization was very difficult to come to, even to the fact, like even to the point that when I graduated from my MDes, I was still applying to traditional architecture firms and roles. I applied to, every firm in and around Boston where I was in school at the time. Um, big firms like Sasaki and Gensler and little firms like Moshe Safdie's office and all of these places that GSD graduates flood to, because either their professors are there or they're more research focused, etc. But none of them fueled my interest and passion for, in many ways, recouping this value on the skills that I'd been building for the last 7 or 8 years. I, I had interviews where people told me the job I was looking for didn't exist. I had interviews where people offered me less money than they were offering to even bachelor's graduates because they felt like, well, a master's degree, like you still don't understand practice. In fact, you're farther away from it. You're more theoretical now. And, salaries in the US, the numbers might seem high to someone, in the UK, for example. I know a lot of architecture salaries are £25,000 or £30,000. But, in the United States, I think like a moderate architecture salary leaving school these days could be 65, 70K, 75K in a big city. My first offer, when I was looking was $42,000. I had more than $60,000 in debt from this degree. Degree programs in the United States are absurd. I spent little over $500,000 on my education over the course of these 7 years. I could not imagine paying myself back for that investment in $40,000 increments, just to break even if I spent no other money on, food, taxes, housing, etc. It would still have taken me 15 years to recoup that cost. And it didn't seem like that was the only answer. So the decision and that exploration came out of real proof points, even though my professors were telling me, my friends were telling me, my colleagues were going into the practice saying, you have to put in your dues and then it'll all just work out. Nothing on the spreadsheet made sense. Like nothing in my gut said that this was going to pencil out for me eventually. And so I just kind of blindly trusted that and ended up going to work for a 5-person startup, of which one of the initial founders was in fact an architect. And so I saw this glimpse at architects doing other things. I also got a lot of that exposure through my master's degree. Professors working for LG and Samsung and doing branding for General Mills and Amazon and all these other places. So I knew that it was something that was attainable. I just didn't know how I would fit into that puzzle quite yet.
That has been so insightful. So, it is so wonderful to see that an architecture degree can open so many doors outside of traditional architecture practice. It is sometimes difficult as architecture graduates to imagine a path like that. How can we explore without feeling like off track or like we are behind because we are so tuned to that traditional architecture pathway? How can we explore with that mindset?
One of the big challenges is that careers in architecture are very linear. They're very single track. And you do get some bifurcations, like a project architect versus a project manager, right? Or, a job captain versus a BIM manager or a technical lead. And there are some specifics there, but ultimately the progression is architectural designer or intern architect up to, an architectural associate to, whatever level stacks up on top of that, ending in principal and partner, etc. Right. And you pass through licensure on the way. You do your part 1, part 2, part 3 in the UK. And, maybe you end up with some like fellowship. We have the FAIA here. I think there's the REBA College of Fellows, etc. But the question in my mind was, what is the differentiation of that work over a career? It seemed like everyone was doing the same thing at different levels of experience, and that everybody wanted me or the rest of the students or the rest of the young career folks to learn the same way that they had and to end up with the exact same skills and to replace them. And I looked around at all of the other people who I'd gone to school with, who weren't in architecture, who were focused in finance, focused in business, focused in strategy, focused in medicine, and all these other specialties. And even within those realms, I was looking at these companies that I thought, well, that's a sports company. But not everybody in there is an athlete. I mean, everybody that's doing the person in the architecture firm doing HR is an architect. But the HR person in every other company is a specialist in this realm. Like, why do we build our companies on this kind of unification of one person? Architecture firms are made up of 700 architects. They're not made up of, well, to some are. The good ones have business development as a specialty, have marketing as a specialty, have finance, have a COO, have a partner that's focused on one specific piece, etc. But it's odd that the funnel is for everyone to start in exactly the same place. And so as someone who really resonated on the technology front, I I didn't feel like there was a risk in going to explore that, because what I always envisioned, and I think is not true today, was that I could go get those skills and bring them back into architecture, and that I could explain that value of why my specialization would be so beneficial to a firm, and to convince them that that would ultimately be the right move if that's what I wanted to do, was to come back into a more traditional practice. But um, I think what I found was I could imagine a career and think 10 steps ahead. But every step, I ended up with a different perspective. And at that point, I looked up and none of the next 9 steps were the same. At the second step, none of those 8 steps were the same. And you find that, really it's about going from point A to point B, not, alpha to omega and in the end. And I think this is a really critical thing that students need to learn, is they're trying to make decisions for the rest of their lives, and they need to make the best decision for them at that time. And if it is to prove your theory that you love architecture, then you should absolutely take that first step into a firm, because you don't know what you don't know. I had a lot of experiences in architecture firms that were what told me that my gut was correct. I didn't just, take the advice of some, middle-aged male out of architecture influencer and say like, oh, architecture is garbage. Like I'll never stay in. So I think testing the bounds for yourself is important. But you said something that's really impactful. People feel like they're worried about wasting their time. I think what's a bigger waste of time is to stay in a place and expect it to change around you. That is a sort of, a bit of a fallacy, is to think that there is, oh, well, if I wait here long enough, what I'm looking for will show up. Absolutely not. You have to go take that first step, learn the things that you like and don't like about that next role, and then take another step and continue to just refine your career over time.
I really love that perspective that not waiting is really important. Taking that step is obviously very important, and that's what many people stop or maybe are scared of. But yeah, as you were saying, so taking these steps, skills are quite important. You spoke about technology. Your master's degree definitely helped shape your careers in so many ways. What do you think are some skills that are very prominent, that are to be learned today, are important, but many people miss?
I do think that we're this quote will probably not age well. I'm going to talk about AI here, so let's see. Let's in 3 weeks we'll come back and see whether this is a valid thing to say. Um, as someone who considers themselves to be a millennial, I'm 35 years old to age myself. I am right in that weird middle ground of people who are kind of over learning new tools, but also capable of really picking up on whatever that next kind of technology wave is. And the thing that has been the most valuable to me over my career, there are two, and they both come from architecture. The first has nothing to do with technology. It is about being able to translate someone's perspective, thoughts, language, tone into something clear and actionable. It is that kind of strategic lens that architects bring when they go to research a site, evaluate a new project, look at the way that the program is supposed to be laid out, the way that when our professor says, like, go research this bird, and you have no idea why they're saying that, but you know that you're going to pull apart every single thing about their migration pattern and their nest structures and the patterns of their feathers and the coloration and the differences in size and scale and all of this. That curiosity, but the ability to use that and to synthesize and communicate off of it, that is my superpower. It has nothing to do with technology. I think technology enables a lot of great things, but I worry that AI will stunt the growth of a lot of those muscles that architects are known for. I think our creative problem solving abilities come from that reflex that is developed that great, athletes have, great musicians have, great creatives have, writers, etc., where you don't have to consciously read every piece of a problem to intuit the answer. That skill is something that comes from like really putting in the time and effort at the age that you are in college to learn and understand those things. So if you're going to architecture school right now, you need to be putting in that kind of mental sweat equity to tackle these problems and challenges. It will give you a unique lens, and it will give you a better access to then the tools and real pieces of technology that I think you do need to learn. So to that effect, I think AI is incredibly powerful. I don't have a stance on, like whether Viscom is the right tool for a young architect these days, or whether, running Claude code to build out custom components for Grasshopper is like the exact right skill to have. What I can say though is that keeping up with those pieces of technology for me was an amplification of the things that I wanted to explore. And so my thesis was really about, in grad school, was about the connectivity of architects based on not style, not visual aesthetic, not material palette, but who worked with who slept with who went to school at the same time. All of these things that, like, as a networker were really obsessive to me. But I was able to port that information into computational tools and ultimately run a Unity simulation to kind of explore this network of architects over several hundred years, hundreds of architects, and to see how they were woven together in space and time. Was that super useful? Not really as like a saleable outcome, but it was this bridge between, I think, the two skills that I'm highlighting, which, knowing and understand the technology gives you the foundation, or gives you the access to explore your foundational skills. But if you don't build that foundation, the tool is just a kind of, thing. Like if there's no substance beneath it, it really becomes a challenge to make true value out of it.
Wow, that's so insightful. By just learning the tools, we do restrict ourselves to a great extent. And it's great you spoke about technology and the right use of it. I really loved that angle. So AI and technology, most students find it very, exciting and sometimes overwhelming. But as you spoke about, it might not be, I can't say it's a misconception, but maybe it's not the only thing that someone should focus on. So, apart from these, what do you think are some misconceptions that young graduates or students have in today's world?
Ooh, that's a little bit of a loaded question, and I have a lot of thoughts on it. I'm going to try and parse through them. The first one that comes to mind that might rub some of our younger listeners the wrong way is I do think there is a heavy amount of entitlement in people coming into the workforce. I think it comes from this extreme disillusionment with the fact that giving and investing time to a company is going to give anything meaningful back to you other than a salary. And, this is coming from someone who has built an entire brand and career on telling people that they shouldn't accept less, right? That they shouldn't bend over backwards or, do unpaid internships or, work overtime for no extra pay. Like I believe all of those things in my heart. But I have worked with a number of young clients, coaching clients, candidates for jobs in recruiting, et cetera, where I think because of the access to information around salaries and the sort of, influencing that happens, which says you can so easily make money now. You can so easily build your own business that does millions and millions of dollars. You can so easily create a product or find a new job, or that there is this sort of like pride in getting the most out of the least. I find that people end up missing the opportunity to build a foundational career. I, you know, I took on a job out of school. I like to mention a lot of numbers because I think it gives context to people. And this was, a decade ago at this point. But I took on a job out of school that was primarily commission based as the director of business development. But I fought really hard for a baseline salary that I felt like met my value. So I mentioned that I got a $42,000 offer in architecture. The base salary of this position was $55,000 plus commission, which I felt like was a really great opportunity. But that commission structure made me work really, really hard to try and close those deals. And it was very apparent that like a lot of the upside was tied to performance. Um, I think you have to think about your role that way, even if the pay isn't structured that way. So much of the learning that we take away from jobs that allow us to get more exciting, better paying jobs, et cetera, come from really putting in the work. So there is a bit of this, yes, I'm investing, I'm doing work for a company. Maybe they're paying me hourly and I feel like they're, bleeding me dry or they want all of these things from me, et cetera. You don't want to stay in a job you hate. But if you have any kind of passion for that work, and if you really do see yourself wanting to move in that direction, you are investing in understanding new project types, getting access to clients, you're investing in learning more specific skills of an industry, et cetera. So I think that's a really like a really odd misconception that is, you know, companies have nothing to give and we don't need to have any loyalty. That shows up later. It shows up when you come to me for recruiting and you say, I'm looking for a job, and I look and I see that you've been at 4 places in 2 years. I want you to go explore other companies, but I want you to do it responsibly, and sometimes you have to clean your resume for that. Sometimes you have to say, I'm not going to put this experience, on a resume because it was not a good fit and it was so short. And I'm just going to have to, eat that 3 months and say that that was a bit of a loss. Over the course of your career, those things really tend to even out. But if you continue to make the same mistake over and over again, it becomes really noticeable. The other misconception is, as I mentioned before, that you have to pick a path. I think that is totally false. You do not have to choose a career. When I was in high school, my best friend had loved statistics, and he told me, well, the average person has 7 careers over their lifetime. And I was like, well, what does that mean? Like 7 jobs? And he's like, no, 7 careers. The average American goes through a pattern of basically changing their career every 7 years. And that's over like a 50-year career approximately. And that really stood out to me because I played through that so many times. In the course of my 9 years in the sportswear industry, I really felt like, well, I had all of these different jobs within that realm. I had a career of sorts, but I left that mid last year and am full time at Out of Architecture. And that is a different career entirely, right? It is entrepreneurial business owner. It's very much focused on talent services and coaching and advising. So I could see how young me would have thought, like, first you become an adjunct professor, then you become an assistant professor, then you become, tenure track, and then you're a dean, and then you're a provost, and you have a research office that you run on the side, and that's your entire career. And there are definitely examples of those people. More often than not, I interview someone who, went to engineering, did 5 to 6 years, thought architecture was going to be super cool, went and got an architecture degree, did 5 to 6 years in an architecture firm, hated it, decided they need to leave and pivot to tech, and they're on their 3rd or 4th career, and they're using those skills really specifically. They're not wasting their time, but they're just finding and honing that story of like what their path is as they go through it.
Wow, that makes so much sense. That cleared so many of my misconceptions about not only architecture but career in general. So when we are talking about, getting onto these opportunities, the first opportunities that you're talking about, apart from skills, how important is networking, portfolio building, and how are all these three linked together?
Yeah, skills and portfolio are probably the closely linked, and I think your portfolio is a great showcase. What it does on the other side of the table is it cuts through a lot of talk. I can see, as someone who's been in the design profession for many years, what tools you're using, what your aesthetic is like, what things you value, what you're putting forth, and often how well you understand the role based on how you're curating your portfolio. I do like web portfolios. This is not the case for most architecture firms, but as someone who bridges that gap, I would rather you send me a portfolio website with clickable project links and be able to dive in and navigate and scroll at my own pace. I think the idea of a portfolio being a book is very antiquated and really frustrating when you get like a 2-up spread that you have to like zoom into on, Adobe Acrobat, and you can't read anything, and then there's no interactivity, and it's very limited. So I like the web version. Networking to me is almost entirely outside of that. Networking is about understanding your personal brand. I don't love that term. I think I like to talk about it as telling your story, but the way that you frame yourself in the world can change. It can change every year. It can change every day, but it has to fit the moment. And one of the things that I coach people on, candidates on, is how to draw this kind of red thread through all of their experiences so that at the end of it, it makes perfect sense why you are the right candidate for this role. I can do that for myself to 60, 70, 80, 100 different roles. I can do that for why I'm the best director of 3D design at a sportswear company. I can talk about why I do that for startup advising or for coaching or as a recruiter or as someone to be on your podcast. And I think those narratives are really, really important, and understanding your past in a way that you can translate between those two things is really critical. But as far as networking goes, it is the entire reason we built Out of Architecture. And Out of Architecture has some individual services, but at its core, it has a community of, at this point, we've got an audience of a little over 70,000. But there is a massive contingent of those people who exist in a community platform called The Collective, which we have launched just at the start of this year, 2026, and which creates space for mentors and mentees and the Out of Architecture team to have real meaningful conversations on all of these topics. We have over 2,000 jobs on our jobs board that are examples and active, places where people can look either aspirationally or as a transition in their own career. We have workbooks and resources and all of these things. And I think being in a space like that, some people, me, I paid multiple hundreds of thousands of dollars to do that for a year and a half at Harvard. And I really want to democratize that kind of network. There is former business development leads from SOM and Big. There are people who are working in, the gaming industry, who are at Amazon, who are at all of these different incredible companies. They're our community, they're our friends, and we're trying to open that up to really young people just like you, who I think would benefit greatly from seeing and experiencing so many of the things that were hard fought for myself and my business partner over our careers, and that now we are just laying out as a foundation for others to follow.
Wow, that's wonderful. This has been such an amazing conversation, and I'm loving every bit of it. In a few words, for any young graduate who's a little confused today, what would you think should be the first step they can take?
I think look at your neighbor in studio or your best friend and ask them, like, how would you stereotype me as a designer or an architect? Like, what would you tell people if you bumped into someone in an elevator and you were going to find me the perfect role? Like, what would you tell somebody about me? That external lens is really important. You don't have to pay me as a coach to get that. And we did a content series, not that long ago, on, if your favorite thing in studio was X, look at these roles. And I think if you can identify that thing, you can get outside of the term of architect and you can start to think about, like, I'm a 3D expert. Like, this is what I love to do. Like, let me go search for jobs that have Rhino in them. Let me go search for jobs that have Grasshopper in them, or topology, or, NURBS modeling, or any of those things, right? You could love visualization. There's tons of visualization roles out there. Any of these kind of specialist pathways, I think, will lead you to something fun and new and interesting. Um, and you may never leave. You may come back and just realize, like, that's something I want to bring to architecture, and that is extremely valuable in and of itself. So I encourage you to get a little bit of, like, kind of some friend therapy.
Wow, I love that perspective. Thank you so much, Jake. It was amazing talking to you. This conversation was really so helpful for me, and I'm sure it is going to be helpful for our audience. Thank you so much for giving us the time.
Thanks, Nikita. It was lovely, lovely to chat with you. And anybody else who is interested is welcome to find me at outofarchitecture.com or on LinkedIn, which is my primary social, as embarrassing as that sounds.